We picture World War I gas attacks as sudden terror. Yellow clouds rolling across no man's land, soldiers screaming, chaos. That's the Hollywood version. Here's what really happened when you were a French infantryman living under constant gas alert. You spent your entire war carrying a metal tin that could save your life or suffocate you. You learned to sleep with one ear listening for the sound that meant 30 seconds to live or die. You discovered that the deadliest gas had no smell, no color, and by the time you felt it killing you, it was already too late. 4 years, 1,300,000 French soldiers dead, 90,000 killed by gas. But the real story isn't how they died, it's how they lived. The first gas attack hit French colonial troops on April 22nd, 1815, near Ypres. 160 tons of chlorine released from 6,000 German cylinders in 10 minutes. The 45th Algerian Division and the 87th Territorial Division had never seen anything like it. No training, no masks, just a wall of yellow-green death moving at walking speed. In seconds, the gas created an 8,000-yard gap in the Allied line. Over 1,000 soldiers died immediately. 4,000 more were wounded, blinded, choking on their own blood. If you value documented World War I history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. The script is researched and factual. Using sources from the Cambridge Journal Medical History, published March 2021, and the French Army's official medical statistics from La Statistique Médicale de l'Armée, documents that reveal the precise casualty numbers and medical protocols that most people never see. Now back to the information. By December 1815, every French soldier carried the M2 gas mask. 29,300,000 were manufactured during the war. Designed by René-Louis Gravereau of Paris, it was a cloth hood covering your entire face, soaked in chemical solutions that neutralized gas. 5 hours of protection against phosgene. After that, you were breathing poison through wet fabric. The mask came in 3 sizes: small, marked PT for petite taille; medium, marked TO for taille ordinaire; large, marked GT for grande taille. If you got the wrong size, gaps around your face meant death. Gas alert procedure became your daily rhythm. Sentries posted near every alarm. Artillery shells converted to bells. Compressed air horns that could be heard 9 miles away. When the alert sounded, you had seconds, not minutes. Seconds. The problem wasn't putting the mask on. Any soldier could do that. The problem was keeping it on for hours while fighting, while your face swelled, while condensation built up inside the eyepieces until you couldn't see, while the straps cut into your skull and you felt like you were drowning in your own breath. The Germans kept changing the game. Chlorine gas you could smell and see. Yellow-green clouds with the scent of bleach, painful but not subtle. By 1816, they introduced phosgene. Colorless. Odorless, except for a faint smell of musty hay that you only detected when the concentration was already lethal. 6 times more deadly than chlorine. 85% of the 91,000 gas deaths in World War I came from phosgene or diphosgene. The symptoms could take 48 hours to show. You'd think you survived the attack. 2 days later, your lungs would start drowning you from the inside. Medical reports from French field hospitals describe what phosgene did to human bodies. Shallow breathing, retching. Pulse jumping to 120 beats per minute. Ashen face. The discharge of 4 pints of yellow liquid from the lungs every hour for 48 hours of drowning spasms. Dennis Winter's study, Death's Men, documented these effects in 1978. The average recovery time for French gas casualties was 60 days for chlorine exposure, 45.5 days for phosgene. That's if you recovered at all. At Verdun, the Germans fired over 60,000 gas shells during the preparatory bombardment on July 9th, 1816. The shells made a different sound when they landed, a soft plop instead of an explosion. Soldiers initially dismissed them as duds. Big mistake. The gas seeped out silently while they waited for the bang that never came. French forces had been equipped with improved M2 masks by this point, so the attack had little effect. But the psychological impact was devastating. Every soft sound, every unexploded shell, meant potential death. Daily life under gas alert meant you never fully relaxed. The mask container stayed on your belt. Always. The weight of it reminded you that any moment could be your last normal breath for hours or forever. You learned to eat, sleep, fight with this metal box hitting your hip. You learned to check your mask twice a day. Were the straps rotting? Was the cloth cracked? Were the chemical solutions still active? A small tear meant breathing poison when the alert came. Winter brought new horrors. Gas lingered in shell holes, in trenches, in low ground where it was heavier than air. The temperature made it worse. Cold air held more gas. You couldn't see it. Couldn't smell it. Couldn't know it was there until your throat started burning. French soldiers developed a paranoia about low places. Dugouts became death traps. Shell craters became off limits. The ground itself was trying to kill you. Then, in July 1817, the Germans introduced mustard gas, Yperite, the French called it, named after Ypres. This wasn't meant to kill you quickly. It was designed to disable you, overwhelm the medical system, turn you into a burden on your own army. Mustard gas didn't need to be inhaled. It burned through your skin, your clothes, your boots. No mask could protect you from liquid death that soaked through wool uniforms and ate flesh. If you value documented history that tells the truth about war, subscribe now. This research comes from primary sources, including the International Labor Office questionnaire responses from 1924 and Base Hospital number 28 clinical records, documents that show exactly how French soldiers were treated and how long they took to recover. These aren't general histories. These are the actual medical files. 120,000 British chemical casualties were from mustard gas alone. The French numbers were proportionally similar. Treatment was primitive. Remove contaminated clothing. Wash the body. Soak the skin in sodium hypochlorite. Wait, the mortality rate was only 2 to 3%, but the suffering was extraordinary. Nurse Vera Britton wrote in her diary, "Great mustard-colored blisters, blind eyes, all sticky and stuck together, always fighting for breath, with voices a mere whisper, saying that their throats are closing and they know they will choke." The French developed the ARS mask in January 1817, delivered to troops in February 1818. Over 5,270,000 examples were produced. Based on the German AGM M15 design O, it had a 42mm threaded canister with 3 layers of absorbent. First layer, charcoal and soda ash. Second layer, pure charcoal. Third layer, impregnated gauze pads. The chemical composition was constantly updated as new gases appeared. It was carried in a metal can that protected it from shocks and water. Instructions for use were printed inside the lid. Gas attacks created a medical crisis beyond the immediate casualties. Gas fright became a recognized condition. Soldiers who believed they'd been exposed when they hadn't. Doctors couldn't always tell the difference between real exposure and psychological symptoms. Both required evacuation from the front lines. Both removed fighting men from the battle. This was part of gas warfare's effectiveness. It didn't need to kill you to take you out of action. By 1818, the French army had adapted to living under constant chemical threat. Gas discipline became second nature. Wind direction mattered. Weather reports weren't about comfort. They were survival intelligence. A shift in the breeze could mean death. Soldiers learned to read atmospheric pressure, humidity, temperature. The weather wasn't just weather anymore. It was a weapon delivery system. The dead zones around Verdun tell the story. 65 square miles declared Zone Rouge after the war. Too dangerous for human habitation, not just because of unexploded shells, but because of chemical contamination. The soil itself was poisoned. This wasn't collateral damage. This was deliberate environmental warfare on an industrial scale. French records show that gas casualties required different evacuation procedures. They were evacuated first, before conventional wounded. Speed was critical for decontamination, but this created logistical nightmares. Hospital trains had to be specially equipped. Medical staff needed protection. Even the stretcher bearers were at risk from contaminated uniforms and equipment. The psychological impact went beyond gas fright. French soldiers lived with the knowledge that their enemy was trying to poison them. Not shoot them, not shell them, poison them. This was personal in a way that bullets and artillery weren't. Gas sought you out in places where you thought you were safe. It followed you into dugouts, into communication trenches, into areas far from the fighting. There was no front line with gas. There was no safe rear area. Production numbers reveal the scale. By war's end, the Germans had produced 68,000 tons of chemical weapons. The French, 36,000 tons. The British, 25,000 tons. Over 124,000 tons of poison manufactured for the sole purpose of making human beings suffer and die. These weren't weapons of military necessity. They were weapons of deliberate cruelty. The training was constant. Gas drill became as routine as rifle drill. Put on the mask, take it off, check the seal, practice breathing through filters, practice fighting while wearing it, practice communicating through the muffling cloth. Practice staying calm while your world shrank to the view through 2 pieces of cellophane and the sound of your own breathing echoing in a chemical hood. French casualties from specific gas attacks show the evolution of the threat. At Seichefe, July 1st, 1817, the last German cylinder attack against French forces. 450 casualties, including 136 deaths, a 30% mortality rate. By this point, the Germans had moved to mustard gas delivered by artillery shells. More precise, more persistent, more terrifying. Battalion strength was measured differently when gas was involved. A unit that took heavy gas casualties might show the same numbers on paper but be combat ineffective for months. The men were alive but couldn't fight, couldn't march long distances, couldn't carry heavy equipment. Gas didn't just kill soldiers, it created a permanent invalid class that drained resources and morale. The real nightmare was combination attacks. Gas followed by conventional assault. You're wearing a mask that limits your vision and hearing. Your breathing is labored. Your rifle is harder to aim. Your officers are shouting orders you can't understand through their masks. And through this chaos, the enemy infantry is advancing with bayonets. This was the tactical reality of gas warfare. It made everything else worse. French military medicine had to invent new specializations overnight. Gas poisoning required different treatment than gunshot wounds, different evacuation procedures, different hospital facilities, specialized nursing care. The war created an entire medical subspecialty around chemical casualties. Doctors became experts in pulmonary edema, blistering agents, delayed toxic effects. Base Hospital Number 28, located near the Somme, provides detailed records of gas treatment protocols. Of 930 patients admitted during the peak gas warfare period, 216 were gas inhalation cases. 250 suffered mustard gas contamination. 22 required treatment for chemical burns. Each category demanded completely different medical approaches. Chlorine gas treatment was expectant care, bed rest, oxygen administration, and waiting. Patients who survived the first 48 hours usually recovered completely. Those who didn't died from pulmonary edema as their lungs filled with fluid. Medical staff could do little except make patients comfortable and hope their respiratory systems could handle the damage. Phosgene cases were more complex because symptoms were delayed. Soldiers who seemed fine immediately after exposure would collapse days later when their lungs began failing. Triage protocols had to account for delayed onset symptoms. Every soldier exposed to suspected phosgene required 48-hour observation, regardless of initial condition. This created massive overcrowding in medical facilities that were designed for immediate trauma treatment. Mustard gas treatment required specialized burn units that didn't exist in field hospitals. Chemical burns progressed differently than thermal burns. Standard burn treatment actually made mustard gas injuries worse. New protocols required immediate decontamination with sodium hypochlorite solution, followed by specialized wound dressings that had to be imported from civilian chemical factories. Ophthalmic treatment became a specialized field within military medicine. Gas attacks created thousands of cases of chemical burns to the eyes. Traditional ophthalmology was useless. These injuries required understanding of chemical damage to corneal tissue. Military eye specialists had to be trained in industrial chemical treatment protocols. New surgical techniques were developed specifically for gas-damaged eyes. Respiratory therapy emerged as a medical discipline during the gas warfare period. Patients with chronic lung damage from chlorine or phosgene exposure required long-term breathing support. Oxygen tents, mechanical ventilation, and respiratory exercises were all innovations driven by gas casualty treatment needs. The medical equipment developed for treating gas victims became the foundation for modern respiratory medicine. Pain management for gas casualties presented unique challenges. Morphine was effective for conventional wounds but had limited value for chemical burns that continued progressing for days after exposure. New pain relief protocols combined traditional opiates with experimental treatments like cocaine injections and alcohol therapy. Medical staff often used more dangerous pain relief methods because conventional approaches were inadequate for chemical suffering. Letters home from French soldiers reveal the daily fear, not the dramatic terror of an attack, but the grinding anxiety of never knowing when the next one would come. Sleep was interrupted by false alarms. Meals were interrupted by gas drill. Every military activity had to account for the possibility that, at any moment, every man might need to seal his face inside a chemical hood and keep fighting. The evolution from M2 to ARS masks shows how quickly the technology advanced. What protected you in 1816 was obsolete by 1817. What worked against chlorine failed against phosgene. What stopped phosgene was useless against mustard gas. Your life depended on a technological arms race between chemists and engineers you'd never meet. Supply chains became life and death logistics. Fresh mask filters, chemical solutions for treating cloth, replacement straps, spare eyepieces, medical supplies specifically for gas casualties, transportation that could handle contaminated equipment. Every aspect of military supply had to account for chemical warfare. By the end of the war, an entire generation of French soldiers had been trained to live under chemical threat. They knew the smell of different gases. They could identify attack patterns by the sound of incoming shells. They could diagnose gas exposure by symptoms. They'd become experts in a form of warfare that violated every previous understanding of military honor. In 1924, the South African government reported to the International Labour Office that gas warfare had created long-term health consequences. Soldiers exposed to mustard gas showed higher rates of cancer decades later. Respiratory problems, skin conditions, psychological disorders. The war didn't end when the fighting stopped. It continued killing slowly, silently for the rest of their lives. But here's what the casualty reports and medical studies don't capture. In October 1918, French military engineers conducting post-battle assessments discovered something that changed their understanding of chemical warfare's true cost. Near the village of Fleury-devant-Douaumont, which had been captured and recaptured 16 times during the Battle of Verdun, they found a mass grave containing 47 soldiers from different units. All killed on the same day in September 1915, the deadliest day in French military history when 22,059 men died on the first day of the Second Battle of Champagne. The gravesite was unusual because it showed no signs of artillery damage, no shell craters, no shrapnel scarring on nearby trees, no evidence of the massive bombardments that characterized every other battlefield burial. Military investigators initially assumed it was a medical evacuation point where soldiers had died of wounds. The truth was worse. Chemical analysis of the soil around the burial site revealed traces of chlorine compounds that had persisted for 3 years in concentrations high enough to kill plant life. The gas that killed these men was still in the ground, waiting. Soil samples taken 20 meters from the grave showed safe levels. 15 meters out, trace contamination. 10 meters out, dangerous concentrations. At the burial site itself, the earth was chemically sterile. The engineers realized they had discovered something unprecedented. A gas attack so massive that it had permanently poisoned the battlefield. The 47 soldiers hadn't been killed by the initial chlorine release. They had died 3 days later when they entered a depression in the ground where heavier-than-air gas had pooled and concentrated. The gas that should have dispersed in hours had lingered for days, waiting in the low ground like an invisible predator. Military records from September 19, 1915, confirmed the horror. The 2nd Battalion of the 359th Regiment had been ordered to advance through the Bois de la Vauche after intelligence reported the area clear of enemy forces. No one mentioned gas. No one ordered protective equipment. No one suspected that 3 days after the German attack, death was still waiting in the woods. The discovery led to a classified investigation that remained secret until 1968. French military engineers found 17 similar sites across the Verdun battlefield, places where gas had pooled in natural depressions, shell craters, abandoned trenches, and ruined buildings. Places where the landscape itself had become a weapon that continued killing long after the battle moved on. War doesn't end, it just changes location.